Good evening, everyone, and welcome, and thank you as always. Thank you so much for joining. As per the usual format, I've muted everyone, but please feel free to use the chat function to unmute yourselves. And I've also posted in the chat group the link to the handout sheet for those who didn't have it. Before I start, I should say that this shiur has been very kindly and generously sponsored by Professor David Hillel Rubin. Le'iloi Nishmas, his father, Binyamin Shmuel Ben Bendet, whose yahrzeit is on Yud Gimel Shvat, the 13th of Shvat. And obviously our hope is that the shiur should be Le'iloi Nishmasoi in his memory. And we wish Professor David Hillel Rubin a Chaim Aruchim and look forward to sharing happy occasions also together. Thank you so much. Now, this shiur is really focused on this wonderful day that we have started celebrating tonight and will continue tomorrow, Tu BiShvat. And I wanted to use our half an hour of, call it Parsha, but half an hour of sort of a midrashic understanding to look a little bit at Tu BiShvat from a more philosophical or hashkafic perspective, and then spends the remaining time looking at some of the halachas of fruit from Israel and the application of these classic halachas to those of us who live in Chutz La'aretz, or at least here in the context of the UK. So first of all, let's start by looking a little bit about Tu BiShvat. And the source of Tu BiShvat is the well-known Mishnah, Arba Rosh Hashanah Heim. The Mishnah tells us there are 4 types of Rosh Hashanah, 4 types of New Year in the halachic system. Be'echad b'Nisan Rosh Hashanah Melochim or Regalim. On the 1st of Nisan is the Rosh Hashanah with respect to kings, the sort of legal passage of years in how documents are written and the like, and with respect to the order of the Shalosh Regalim. Somebody pledges a sacrifice or charitable donation, perhaps. One has an obligation to give this after the passage of 3 of the Shalosh Regalim in order, and the cycle starts from Nisan, from Pesach is the first of the Shalosh Regalim. The Echad Be'elul, the first of Elul is Rosh Hashanah L'Maaseh Behema, and Rabbi Lezer and Rabbi Shimon say no Be'echad B'Tishri. So when it comes to calculating tithing of animals, and effectively the start and finish of the tithing year or tax year for animals, knowing which animals were born in which year, either the first of Elul or the first of Tishri is the new year for that. Be'echad B'Tishri, Rosh Hashanah L'Shonim or L'Shmitim or L'Yovis and Tir L'Rakos. The first of Tishri, which we're very familiar with as the Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, that's the New Year for years. That's why we call it Rosh Hashanah, for the calculation of years. That's when the year changes its number from 5782 to 5783, or whatever it may be. Also, it's the start of the year for Shemitah and Yovel and various other halachas. And finally, Be'echad BiShvat, on the 1st of Shvat, Rosh Hashanah Le'ilon, is the new year for the tithing calendar of trees, Kedivrei Beis Shammai, according to the view of Beis Shammai. But Beis Hillel, after whom we pasken, and therefore we keep Tu BiShvat, says B'chamisha Asaboi. It's the 15th of that month, the 15th of Shvat, which is the new year for trees, for the tithing of trees. So this is the halachic source for the Tu BiShvat being the new year of trees. The concept of having several new years is perhaps one that's unfamiliar to us, until we reflect that actually we used to the idea. It occurs in many circumstances. In secular legal system, you may have the 1st of April as the new year for tax. Every individual company may have its own year and its own calendar. There's different new years for insurance, and they have their own new year. There's an academic new year. So the concept of different events and different professions and different activities having their own new year is one with which we're familiar when we stop and think about it. And therefore, similarly, the halachic system has a parallel idea that different activities and different sorts of products have different rationale behind them as to what is the logical new year for these events. So this is what Rosh Hashanah Le'ilonos is. And as we said, there's other new years listed. So as we mentioned, Shemitah and Yovel. At the Rosh Hashanah, the 1st of Tishri is when one's not allowed to plow, when one's not allowed to sow, and so on and so forth. In fact, next Rosh Hashanah will be the start of Shemitah, again in Eretz Yisrael, and close to the time we'll talk about this. And with respect to trees and the growth of trees, this is the tax year for the start of the tithing year, the tax year for these products. Meaning to say, and we'll look at this when we speak about the halachic section later, there is an obligation to tithe, to take ma'aseh and truma, various tithes from fruit that grow on the tree. And Rashi already explains in the Mishnah, I think I printed this in the source sheet, le'ilon, says Rashi for trees, le'inyan ma'aseh, with respect to the tithing of ma'aseh. Each year's growth has its own tax year, and one can't tithe from the produce of one year onto the produce of another year. And with trees, we follow the chanita, the budding of the tree. So a fruit which has begun budding before Tu BiShvat counts as last year's fruit. A fruit that begins budding after Tu BiShvat counts as next year's fruit. So this is the halachic basis of Tu BiShvat. And the Gemara explains why Tu BiShvat, whether the 1st of Shvat or the 15th of Shvat, is the halachic threshold. And the Gemara says, this is printed in source 2, Be'echad b'Shvat Rosh Hashanah le'ilon, my tama, what's the reason? Rabbi Oshia, Hoyol v'yotzu rov gishmei shana. Since most of the rain of the year has already rained by this point, I'll post again in the chat group for those who've joined late. If you haven't got the source sheet, you can download it from the link in the chat group. So Rashi explains, Hoyol v'yotzu rov gishmei shana, since most of the raining of the year has come. Shekava, this is on source 2. Shekava ova rov yimos hageshamim, most of the year's rain has come. V'olah hasraf le'ilamos, the tree is already beginning to draw in liquid, the nymphs are peris chontimata, and therefore they begin budding from now. So the logic of Tu BiShvat is it's still winter, the trees are still fairly dormant. Nonetheless, they have been given already the resources that they need to grow for the next year, and therefore this is the start of their new year, of productivity. Interestingly, we don't look at the actual year of productivity, which is many months off till the fruits are ready to be eaten, but we look at the resources, the potential. The tree has already received everything that it needs to receive, and therefore this has now started its the halachic start of the new year for trees with respect to taxation. Now, all of this is very interesting and very important for the halachas of trumas and masas, which we'll speak about later. But what's fascinating over here is the history of when did this actually become a day of celebration. Because you will notice that the Mishnah says nothing about this being a day that we should celebrate. It says nothing about this being a Yom Tov of sorts. It says nothing about any of the halachic or minhag practice that we have around this. So when did Tu BiShvat become a day of celebration, firstly? And secondly, why on earth is it a Jewish holiday? It's true, it has implications for halacha, for the beginning of the calculation of the tithing season. However, in principle, in essence, it represents a natural phenomena. It's a day of nature. It's very unusual. In fact, of all, perhaps we don't stop and think about this, of all the special days in the Jewish year, it's the only one not in an essence, in and of in itself, associated with an event in our history. It's not in and of in itself a Jewish event. Pesach, of course, is connected with spring, but fundamentally the Yom Tov of Pesach is Yetzias Mitzrayim. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur aren't natural cycle events whatsoever. They're not associated with the seasonality at all. These are the days of Yom Noraim, the days of Teshuvah. Sukkot, Shavuos have a natural link to part of the cycle of nature, but nonetheless they celebrate in essence something which is fundamentally Jewish. Shvat doesn't seem to have a Jewish nature at all. It's certainly perfectly appropriate and right that we should thank for the gifts of nature. And for example, as we're familiar with from Tu BiShvat, when we eat a new fruit, we say Shechianu. But it's interesting that this is in and of in itself has become a festival of sorts. And in a few moments, we will see the thoughts of one of the Chassidic masters on this matter. But for now, I turn to history. When did this become, when did this develop? We find no evidence of this being a minhag in the Gemara or the Mishnah. It's not recorded in the Gemara or the Mishnah that this has any significance beyond the tax year. We don't find any particular reference to it at all. Now, the earliest records we have of this being a day of celebration is from piyutim that have been found written by Paitonim in Eretz Yisrael, not in Bavel, in particular Rabbi Yehuda Halevi ben Hillel, not the more famous Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the very famous Python, a less well-known Python, who was based in Eretz Yisrael, and we find him writing piyutim for Tisha B'Av. Now, piyutim were based on supply and demand. People enjoyed the poetry of the piyutim, they enjoyed singing them, and therefore if you find a piyut, it's evident that people on Tu BiShvat wanted to gather together and express what they were feeling, and therefore turned to a piyut to express what they were feeling. That's how piyutim were practiced. And therefore, we know, at least from the era of the Geonim in Eretz Yisrael, we're talking about the Muslim periods of rulership in Eretz Yisrael, about the 7th to the 11th century or so, we have evidence by then that Tu BiShvat had become a minhag and people were celebrating it. In fact, we know the contents of some of these piyutim. One of them is a list in the order of the Aleph base of all plants and fruits and so on found in Eretz Yisrael, and various other very beautiful piyutim. Now, for reasons that are beyond the scope of this particular shiur, many of the minhagim of Eretz Yisrael made their way into the Ashkenazi, not the Sephardi community. Very briefly, we know that Eretz Yisrael and Bovel were split in minhag. We have reference from the Gemara to that. There were 2 Gemaras written, the Talmud Yerushalmi, which is more accurately the Talmud of Eretz Yisrael, and the Talmud Bavli. Eretz Yisrael's community declined first. The Talmud Bavli was never completely edited. Many of the traditions were brought over to Bavel. Our halachic practice is based, both in the Ashkenazi and Sephardi world, is based upon the dominance of the Talmud Bavli, of the Babylonian Talmud, and that is how halacha works. Nonetheless, in the realm of minhag, many of the minhagim in Eretz Yisrael were moved through Europe to Germany, whilst the Sephardi minhagim in Bovel, based in Bovel, spread through the Sephardi world. So when it comes to piyut and minhag, Ashkenaz is influenced by the minhagim of Eretz Yisrael. The route, by the way, just very briefly, through which these minhagim arrived in Germany and France, Ashkenazi world, was through Italy. Jews arrived from Eretz Yisrael to Italy, therefore Italian minhagim were more influenced by Eretz Yisrael, and from there they sailed up the Rhine and into Germany. And we know of families, particularly the Klonimus family, who were very prolific Paitonim and Rabbonim, who brought over the Meshulam and Klonimus and Klonimus ben Meshulam, these are familiar names. They brought over piyutim to Germany, and that was affected by Eretz Yisrael minhagim. So the minhag that we have in the Ashkenazi world came, of Tu BiShvat, came via the Ashkenazi world, and initially was only kept amongst Ashkenazim. It arrived in the, for example, I should mention, one of the earliest Ashkenazi authorities, Rabbi Gershom, early 1100s, a teacher of Rashi, already gave the psak that one isn't allowed to fast on Tu BiShvat, and this eventually spread through the Ashkenazi world and then into the Sephardi world. By the time we get to the 1600s, the 16th century rather, and Sfat, this is already something which has become a Sephardi practice also, and therefore in source 3 I print the Shulchan Aruch. Tu B'Av, that's a different matter, the Tu B'Av, v'lo b'Tu BiShvat, and also not on Tu BiShvat, v'lo b'Rish Chodesh, v'lo b'Mincha L'Shvana, v'lo b'Chanukah, etc. So the Shulchan Aruch in source 3 at the bottom of page 1 is listing days when we don't say Tachnun, and there are obvious days in this list. Chanukah, Rish Chodesh. Tachnun is when we fall on our faces in davening. It's an entreaty with a pleading and begging nature to it, which isn't in accordance with special days of celebration. So we understand Purim, Chanukah, certainly Shabbos, Rish Chodesh. We don't do Nefilas Apayim, we don't fall on our faces, we don't say Tachnun. But interestingly, Tu BiShvat has also made this list. And if we look in the Mogen Avram, which are printed at the top of page 2, Mogen Avram, a Perush, a commentary, a very important halachic work on the Shulchan Aruch, written by Rabbi Avram Gombina, who we're talking here in the mid to late 1600s, very important halachic authority. He, parents, by the way, massacred in the Chalmonetsky massacres of 1648. He was raised as an orphan, became a very important, perhaps one of the most important commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. The Mogen Avraham paskins in his commentary, Rosh Hashanah le'Ilonos, he says this is the Rosh Hashanah le'Ilonos, v'noegim ha'ashkenazim lahabis b'minei peretz le'Ilonos. And the Ashkenazi practice is that we ensure that we have lots of fruit on Tu BiShvat, not a mention of 15, but the idea of increasing and having a large amount of fruit on Tu BiShvat as this celebration. So this is a very, very ancient minhag to treat Tu BiShvat as a minor Yom Tov of sorts, not to say Tachnun and to celebrate it. As I said, its origins are not from the Mishnah and Gemara, but were already practiced in Eretz Yisrael, perhaps in the late era of the Talmud Yerushalmi, or certainly in the era that followed it, the very early Geonim of Eretz Yisrael. However, the mystery remains, what exactly makes this a Jewish Yom Tov? This is, by the way, why when I saw this cartoon which I printed, I don't really put cartoons in my handout sheets. This is why I printed this cartoon there, because besides the joke of the cartoon, it brings out really this question: what actually is Jewish about Tu BiShvat? And this question is asked in a sefer called the Shem MiShemuel, which I printed on page 2. Shem MiShemuel is a very, very fascinating work. It's actually 9 volumes, I think, of a collection of drush taught by the Shem MiShemuel, taught by Rabbi Shmuel Bornstein. He was from a prominent Chassidic family. He was the son of Rabbi Avraham Bornstein, who was the Avnei Nezer, a very important Chassidic posek. He was the Sochachov Rebbe. He became a Rebbe in a town called Sochachov. And he used to give a drush every week on the Parsha and on various events. And for 16 years, from 1910 to 1926, he gave this drush. And it was collected into this work. And it's become a very popular Chassidic work, learnt even by non-Chassidim, because it synthesizes the Torah of Kotsk, and it's written in a style in which one can relate to it. And this important Chassidic thinker, as I said, was the Rebbe to thousands in Sochachov, a Polish city, and in Łódź and Lodz in the late 19th century, early 20th century. He speaks about this, and he asks this question in source 6 on page 2. Yesh Lisbonin, he says, one needs to reflect the Inyan Tu BiShvat. She'enim Tachnun, this Tu BiShvat that we don't sound it Tachnun. Halomashu Rosh Hashanah Inyan Yudava Tivi. The fact that this is the new year for trees is a natural event. And so he goes on, he says this is a natural event that occurs in nature. What's this got to do with the celebration? Why shouldn't we say Tachnun on this? What makes this a Yom Tov? There's nothing wrong with celebrating nature and appreciating it, but we have a way of doing that. We say brachos. If it's a new fruit, we say shechiyonu. Why should there be a Yom Tov, this sort of new Yom Tov around a natural season? There's no link between this natural occurring event and any matter of sanctity and kedusha in itself. So asks the Sochachov Rebbe, celebrating nature, not a bad thing, but where is the sanctity? What makes this a Yom Kodesh, a holy day? And the reason really why I wanted to share this piece is because he gives a reflection, a meditation, which I think is something that when I first heard, I found enriching, and it helped me look at the world a little differently. And I hope that all of us, once we've heard this, will never quite eat a fruit again in the same way, or even see a tree. I referenced part of this idea, by the way, very briefly in my drasha. I give out a sort of 5-minute weekly drasha, and I referenced this idea partly, but here he elaborates on this in a more profound manner. And he says that we need to look at the cycle of nature, which of course is a natural and physical phenomena, but we also need to reflect what that tells us about life. And we know that we use Shomayim and Oretz, heaven and earth, as a metaphor for the realm of the physical and the realm of the spiritual. Indeed, the Pasuk says, Bereshis bara Elokim, in the beginning Hashem created, as Shomayim v'es Oretz, the heaven and the earth. And we don't know what this means, the heaven and earth, because after all, the globe, planet Earth, hasn't yet even been created at this point. And when we use the word Shomayim, what do we mean when we talk about Shomayim? It's referring to spiritual matters. Maybe we talk about Yiras Shomayim, fear of the heaven. Someone has fear of the sky, has a phobia, skyophobia or the like. But this isn't. Why is Yiras Shomayim something positive? Why do we talk about Torah min ha-Shomayim, Torah coming from the heaven? So I think I've shared this before. one of my favorite stories, the cosmonaut, the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, was quoted by the communist propagandists as saying I've gone to the heavens, he went to the skies, he went to space, and there is no God there. He was no theologian, though he may have been a good cosmonaut. This was one of my favorite stories until I found out that actually it was untrue, like a lot of well-known stories. Yuri Gagarin was a closet believer. He was a Russian Orthodox Christian. He kept very quiet about that in communist Russia. But after he died, they found his diaries and his memoirs and so on. And he certainly didn't say this quote. It was dreamt up by some Soviet bureaucrat who thought this would be a good line to give him as having said. So either way, so it wasn't Yuri Gagarin, but this Soviet bureaucrat came up with this line. But of course, this isn't what we mean. The literal meaning of the word shamayim is probably that which is beyond, perhaps linked to the word shom, that which is there. So shamayim means everything which is there, everything which transcends physicality, everything which is beyond us. So in the physical world, that's the heavens, but in the spiritual world, it means that which transcends us. Bereshis bara Elokim, in the beginning Hashem created es hashamayim es haaretz, the heavens and the earth, means he created shom, everything which is there, everything that's beyond. In modern English, we say that which is transcendent, that which transcends physicality. Is shom, is shamayim, is there. And that which is here is oretz. He created a physical realm and a realm of the transcendent. And in regular life, that which is beyond is the horizon, that which is beyond us is the skies. But when we talk about Yiras Shamayim, we mean awe of the transcendent, fear of the transcendent. I don't want to lose that which is transcendent in me, that which is beyond, that which isn't just physical, but that which is beyond. However, the Sochatchover Rebbe, the Shem MiShemuel, argues that we are meant to reflect upon this when we look in nature. And we're meant to look at a world in which every time we experience a downpour, we experience a drizzle, it's raining, we're meant to look at that in the eyes of the Nevi'im, as the Nevi'im taught us, and see an event of reflective and meditative significance taking place, in which we become aware that Earth itself doesn't have the resources to sustain itself. It needs to receive bracha from above. It needs to receive something from beyond. So when we go through a shower, we should realize what we are experiencing in this moment is a link between the shamayim and the oretz, between the heavens and the earth. Now, of course, we know ultimately where this water that's from shamayim comes from. It's been through the water cycle. It's arisen from earth itself. Spirituality arises from earth itself. It rises up and becomes transcendent. Remember the shiur we gave on the sulam, the ladder, linking heaven and earth, in which we spoke about the origin of the angels being down here on earth, not in heaven. It rises to heaven, but then it falls back down. The heaven can only survive, it can only be sustained if we receive, the earth, can only be sustained if we receive the input from the heavens. Materialism, physicality can't last by itself. It needs the input from that which is beyond it, the rain that falls on it, which from that generates growth of new life here on earth. And he cites the psukim in Yeshaya, in which Yeshaya uses this very metaphor, this very analogy, to speak about the words of Hashem, Ki kasheyu tageshem asherid min hashamayim, the rain and the snow falls from the heavens, the V'shomon Yoshev and doesn't return but Kiyim as a ruach as oretz v'nidul v'tzmicha, gives birth and it brings life. Keni devarai asher yetzi mipi, so says Hashem, should be my word, that is my mouth, that should fall down on earth and it should generate growth, the growth power of rain. So this is a reflection. The Sochatchover Rebbe is calling upon us to, every time we experience rain, to pause for a few moments and think about this. And then he carries on and says, this is also we're meant to look when we see a tree, because a tree is a remarkable thing. A tree is a bridge between the raw earth, which is inedible and coarse and rough and has no form to it and no usability to it. And yet out of the tree grows fruit, grows something wonderful, grows something beautiful, grows something with quality, with sweetness, with edibility and energy that we can absorb to it. So a tree is a bridge and a link between the raw physicality of earth and fruit that we wish to produce. And he then cites the pasuk, which makes the metaphor between a human being and a tree, specifically so, a very strange pasuk in Devarim, printed in source 4 at the top of page 2, in which the pasuk says, Ki ha'odom eit hasodeh. We've looked before actually in depth in this pasuk. It's a very strangely formulated language. It's talking about a halacha not to besiege, when one besieges a city, a Jewish army should not destroy trees. And then it says this phrase, which can be interpreted in amongst the Mefarshim in 7 or 8 ways because it's such unclear use of language. Why shouldn't you do so? Ki ha'adam eitz hasodeh, which maybe means, is a man a tree? Is the tree your enemy? But that's not quite what the pasuk says. The pasuk says, Ki ha'adam eitz hasodeh, for man is a tree. So at least midrashically, the pasuk is telling us that it's a comparison between a human being and a tree. Every time one sees a tree, one should look at this tree and say, wow, this is amazing. It draws up raw material, and out of it produces some fruit, something beautiful. Can I live up to that? Can I be a tree? Can I also be the link between the heavens and the earth? He then brings it in Chassidic style a gematria. The gematria of a tree is 91, which is the same gematria as the 2 names of Hashem. Hashem has 2 principal names. We pronounce one and read the other. Yud Kei Vav Kei, which is the transcendent, the name of absolute existence that we can't pronounce because ultimately we can't connect to it. Hoya Hove V'yeh, the literal meaning of the name Yud Kei Vav Kei is he was, is, and will be. In other words, he is the great Izzah, the great being that is, but above time and space, that which is transcendent. And then we also call him Adnus, Aleph Daled Nun Yud Adonai, meaning he's the master. That's the God that is here on Oretz that we can relate to and connect to. And therefore he says this is the bridge between the transcendent and the actual, the immanent. This is the gematria of Ilan. So when we look at a tree, we should see this link, this transcendence between them. Every time we do a mitzvah, every time we perform something of worth, we are taking raw physicality, the earth, and we are producing something positive out of it. And as such, it is the bridge that links the two, that links the ground and the payus, the fruit that we are meant to be able to achieve. I cited here also in the source sheet the pasuk, the famous pasuk in Mishli, which I'm not going to go into now. That the Torah itself is compared to a tree, because the Torah itself is meant to be this pipe that can channel in raw energy and raw material and produce something of beauty, produce plant fruit from it. He finally, though, finishes off with a remarkable idea in which he says, well, now let's think about the other category of fruits, vegetables. In halachic terms, I should tell you, both fruit and vegetables are peiros. There are not 2 words for these 2 edible growths. A fruit and a vegetable, what we call in English a fruit and a vegetable, in Hebrew are both referred to as peirot. They're both fruits. However, there's fruits which are pri ha'et, there's fruits which are produced on the tree, and therefore we say borei pri ha'et on them. And there's fruits which are produced on the ground, which are borei pri ha'adama. They are produce of the ground itself directly. And in the Shem MiShemuel's thinking, in this Chassidic meditative mindset that he's sharing with us, when we see a vegetable, we should see something produced without the mediation of a tree. Something, the ability of the ground to directly produce something of value. What defines a vegetable is that there is no independent bridge between it and the ground. It is the product of the ground directly, rather than through the intermediary of a tree, without the mediation of a tree. A vegetable either grows directly in the ground, like a potato or an onion or a lettuce, or it grows through a plant that isn't an independent existence. The tomato plant comes up, it produces the tomato, and then the plant shrivels away, unlike a tree, which is its own structure. And he says, this is what are you meant to meditate on when you see a vegetable? These are the parts of earth which don't need an intermediary, in which the ruchnius, the spirituality, emerges directly from the ground. Where is the sacrosanct ground? Where does ground have kedusha itself, unmediated, unbridged? The Beis Hamikdash, Eretz Yisrael. These are patches of kedusha in the land which have been given by HaKadosh Baruch Hu intrinsic holiness. They are places where there isn't a need for a bridge. They are raw physicality, and in the raw physicality, something spiritual can be achieved. That's Eretz Yisrael. You live in Eretz Yisrael, you appreciate just the regular life, day-to-day life, the scenery, the fruit, you eat the fruits of the land, and that has intrinsic kedusha to it, has intrinsic worth to it in the thinking of the Sochatchav Rabbi of the Shem MiShemuel. There you don't need trees. That refers to a place which is imbued with holiness by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In contrast, other areas are not imbued with holiness. We humans need to bridge the gap. And those are fruits of the tree. So this is a meditation of the Shem MiShemuel. He's trying to give us things, an experience to reflect upon as we wander through our physical lives. So that every time we eat a fruit, every time we eat a vegetable, every time we see a tree, and every time we're caught in a downpour, we have something to think about. And this is, he says, the idea, the reflection, the spirituality that Israeli Eretz Yisrael Minhag, later transported to Ashkenaz, gave rise to. This is the spirituality of a Tu BiShvat. Now I'm going to stop the midrashic half of the shiur at this point, and we're going to move to the halachic part of the shiur. But the truth is, it's going to be an exact continuation, because we're immediately going to start talking about the halachas of the fruit of Eretz Yisrael. And the concept behind these halachas is, of course, the fruit of Eretz Yisrael has kedusha, has holiness, which creates certain mitzvahs which need to be performed. And what I want to use the remaining time available to us is to discuss the halachas of buying fruit from Eretz Yisrael and what we need to know about it.
Rabbi, may I make a comment about the fruit we just talked about?
Can I push off afterwards, because we're a little short of time. I'm going to ask you to we'll do that afterwards if that's okay. I apologize, Moshe. I'm happy to take a comment by text, by chat.
No problem.
So this is the halachic concept of fruit that's grown in Eretz Yisrael, which has truma, which has various halachas associated with it. Now, it is a terribly sad thing for people to feel unable to buy Israeli produce here in England because of a lack of clarity about its halachic status. There are times when one needs to be careful about buying Israeli product, particularly as we approach Shemitah. We will talk more about that as we head towards Rosh Hashanah and the start of the Shemitah year. However, certainly most of the time it's pity if we go to the supermarket or we get a delivery and we need to note that this is products, these are peppers from Eretz Yisrael, avocados from Eretz Yisrael, or potatoes or oranges from Eretz Yisrael, and we feel we need to return it and we're unable to consume it. So what are the halachas that we need to be aware of if we get fruit from Eretz Yisrael? And I should tell you, we should view this as something tremendously positive. Obviously, all of us would love to be able to live in Eretz Yisrael. For whatever reason, we are unable to do so at this stage in our lives. In the past, people would long to go to Eretz Yisrael in order to be able to perform these mitzvahs. Gradolim spoke about their desperate desire to be there in Eretz Yisrael to perform these mitzvahs. Nowadays, the wonders of international trade mean that we have the opportunity to learn these halachas and fulfill them to a degree, a very limited degree, even here in Chutz La'aretz. Now, in Eretz Yisrael, there are various tithes, separations that need to be taken. I will go through them briefly later. Truma and Maaseh and so on and so forth. However, the first point that needs to be made is that untithed fruit has the halachic status of tevel. So fruit, fit for human consumption. I'm not talking about animal food. Human food, which was grown in Eretz Yisrael, has two types of halachas associated with it. The first is a positive mitzvah. Truma and Maaseh should be taken from it. And the second is a negative, a prohibition, that until this tithing has occurred, the fruit is forbidden. It's tevel, it's effectively non-kosher food. Now, how does this affect us? Well, fruit that arrives in Chutz La'aretz has been grown in Eretz Yisrael and therefore has the obligation of tithing on it. It has the obligation of Truma and Maaseh to be taken. And until that has occurred, it's tevel, shouldn't be eaten. Now, why is this halacha not commonly known about? Why is this something which isn't commonly addressed? And what should one do if one has been unaware of this halacha until now? And the answer is there's several reasons why this isn't something that was spoken about in the past. The first one was the fact that actually Israeli fresh produce in the past, there's fairly limited import of it. Other than Jaffa oranges, really in the past, no one had Israeli produce. Nowadays, incidentally, most Jaffa oranges don't come from Israel at all. But most of the produce that was arriving from Israel to Chutz La'aretz was manufactured. Wine and food, canned food and tinned food and the like, which had a hechsher by definition, or ought to have had a hechsher, and therefore one didn't need to know about these halachas. It's fairly recent that there's been mass import of fresh Israeli produce. This is the first reason it's not much spoken about. The second reason is because there was an assumption that all exported Israeli fruit had been supervised by the Israeli rabbanut. Many people assumed that Israeli produce was under a type of rabbanut hechsher, like is the case, thankfully, in much of Israel. So even in Israel, one does have to check that when one buys fruits and vegetables, it has a hechsher, but almost everything in Eretz Yisrael has a hechsher, at least of the rabbanut, the government cross-country hechsher authority. However, fruit exported to England, this is almost certainly not the case. Almost certainly the Rabbanut has not tithed it. This is very large scale farmers, agricultural producers who produce for exporting, and they don't bother tithing it. So this is the second reason why perhaps this wasn't known, because of the assumption that produce was tithed. The third reason this halacha wasn't known or wasn't practiced is because, in all fairness, there is an argument about this. And let me try and explain the halachic debate around this issue. Does fruit and vegetable exported to Chutz La'aretz actually need tithing? Now, the predominant opinion, and the one we might assume as obvious, is that it certainly does need tithing. After all, it grew in Israel. The obligation to tithe it occurred onto this fruit, in the same way as fruit which remains in Israel. Why should it disappear just because it's being exported to Chutz La'aretz? And this is indeed the majority opinion. However, the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch both say fruit that is exported does not need tithing. So how are we meant to make sense of this? Why should fruit that's exported not need tithing? And the answer is, well, it depends exactly what they mean. Because when we talk about fruit produced in Eretz Israel, which therefore has the sanctity of Eretz Israel and needs tithing, we don't just mean it's grown in Eretz Israel, we also mean processed there in Israel. The production is part of the processing is part of what produces the fruit, and it's only once it's been processed to some degree that the obligation of Trumas and Maasros now occurs, now falls on it, because at this point it has finished its manufacturing process. So what is called the product of Israel doesn't just mean that which has grown in Israel, but also that which has been processed to a certain degree. I'm not going to go into the measure of processing, but the obligation to take Trumas and Maasros once it's processed. So one way of reading the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch is that they are saying that even things which have grown in Israel, if they are processed abroad, do not have the sanctity of products that need tithing, because they weren't completed in Israel, they were processed abroad. That's one way of reading the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch. According to that, most of the fruit and veg that we get in England, which has been completely processed in the UK, we completely processed in Israel, would certainly be obligated in Trumas and Maasros, and only maybe certain specialized products which are exported from Israel unprocessed and are completing their processing in Israel, in England, only those would be exempt. So if we talk about simple products, avocados and pears and potatoes and all these sorts of things, the processing is very minimal. It's really just gathering them together and packaging them and sending them abroad. These would certainly be obligated in Trumas and Maasros, because even though the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch say things which are exported do not need tithing, they mean, according to this reading, things exported and processed abroad. However, there is a significant minority opinion, the view of the Bach, one of the senior poskim of Yoel Sarkis, who says, no, let's take what they say on face value. Anything exported, since it was grown in Israel with intention to export, didn't get the full halachic kedusha of things grown in Israel. A remarkable view. Produce grown in Israel for consumption in Israel has the halachas of tithing. Produce grown in Israel for consumption abroad doesn't have the halachas of tithing. So there's a significant minority opinion that believes no tithing is necessary. Why do I share this minority opinion with you? For several reasons. The first is, if anyone is listening to this shiur and has not been tithing until now, there's no need to panic. You should know that there's a significant opinion that one doesn't need to do so. Similarly, if you eat in someone's house who doesn't tithe, don't worry, there's a significant halachic opinion that one doesn't need to do so. However, certainly once one has learned the halachas, it is appropriate if one buys fruit from Eretz Israel to tithe it and to keep things to the best standard. There's no reason not to. It's a very simple procedure, as we will soon shortly learn. It takes a second to do. Take a tithing, cut a small piece of the fruit off, as we'll discuss, wrap it in a bag and dispose of it, and one has connected oneself in a wonderful and beautiful way to the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael and to the mitzvahs of Eretz Yisrael. So this is a beautiful mitzvah. It's the Chassidic way of eating fruit and vegetable, but this shiur is not intended to panic anyone who hasn't been doing this till now, or chas v'shalom to create a rift if people do and people don't. There's an important halachic opinion that one does not need to tithe. Nonetheless, certainly, ideally speaking, one should do so and connect to the fruit of Eretz Yisrael in this way. So the remainder of the shiur, I'm going to talk about how to tithe and what these halachas involve, so that we can perform the mitzvah in the optimal manner. Nonetheless, you should know that in Chutz La'aretz we never do this mitzvah with a bracha. Why don't we do this mitzvah with a bracha? We do the mitzvah because we want to in an optimal manner, but because there's significant doubt about the fulfillment of the mitzvah in Chutz La'aretz, we don't do it with a bracha. What's the doubt? Well, it's possible it has been tithed already at source. In general, as I said, this isn't the case, but some is tithed at source when the producer planned to sell it on the Israeli market and then changed their mind and exported it. So we're never quite certain what the status of the fruit is. And secondly, there's significant opinions that we do not need to tithe, and therefore we do not make a bracha on tithing. Nonetheless, it is appropriate to do so. So this is part one. Part two, I'm going to explain in great depth how tithing works and what the halachas are. And it will be somewhat complicated. If you follow it, fantastic. If it is overwhelmingly confusing, or you're not taking notes tonight because you just wanted to join a shiur and listen to it, don't worry, because in part three, I will explain in practical halacha what we do. And in practical halacha, it really is, it's not complicated. It's fairly straightforward and simple. In theoretical halacha, understanding how we achieve the simplicity, there's a lot of beautiful Torah to say. So, what we have said so far is that fruit grown in Eretz Yisrael is obligated in tithing. Such fruit is forbidden until it's been tithed. Fruit which is exported has a number of doubts. Maybe it's already been tithed, maybe not. The minority opinion that you don't need to tithe exported fruit. The majority opinion that one does need to tithe exported fruit. Therefore, l'chatchila, in the first instance, ideally speaking, we do tithe it. And we're now going to discuss how to tithe it and what the basis of the logic of how we tithe it is, and then we will conclude in the remaining time available to us right at the end on a practical level how to do this. So just a brief run through most of the tithes. The first tithe is truma, which goes to the Kohen. It's called truma gadola, and it goes to the Kohen. Now, in the times of the Beis HaMikdash, one was expected to give generously, to give a measured amount. However, nowadays, for at least one and perhaps two reasons, Kohanim cannot eat truma. The first reason is Kohanim are impure, they are tomei, we don't have a pora aduma. All Kohanim have had exposure to tumas meis, to dead bodies, and therefore Kohanim cannot in practice eat truma. Secondly, there are perhaps doubts around exactly how we know who is a Kohen, and this is possibly a second halachic complication. As a result, truma, which can only be eaten by a Kohen, cannot, once it's tithed, cannot in practice be given to a Kohen to eat. And as a result, we dispose of it, as I described, by putting it in a plastic bag and disposing of it, but we'll come back to that later. How much truma do I need to take for this truma? The answer is anything, a tiny crumb. Why? Because in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, when Kohanim could actually eat truma, one should give a decent amount. One shouldn't be a miser. One would give a 50th or perhaps even a 40th if one was more generously inclined, 2% or so. Nowadays, where we can't give truma in practice to a Kohen, it would simply be bal tashchis. It would be a waste to give anything more than a minimal amount. And since as far as core halach is concerned, a tithing of a tiny amount is enough, that is sufficient. So this is the first point. This is truma. After I've taken truma, I now need to take 10%, which is ma'aseh, and this needs to be given to the Levi. Now, this 10% is a fixed amount. I have to take the 10%. This isn't negotiable. I can't give a small amount. However, in practice, I don't need to give it to the Levi. Why do I not need to give it to the Levi? Because the Levi will want to claim it, but the Levi cannot prove I'm obligated to give this maaseh. As we already explained, maybe a very small quantity has been tithed in Israel. We don't know for certain it hasn't been tithed. In addition, there's minority opinions that I don't need to tithe at all. The Levi would have to prove to me their Levite status. Therefore, in practice, I don't need to give it to the Levi. And actually, I can eat it myself, because unlike truma, which can only be eaten by a Kohen, maaseh can be eaten by anyone. It's the property of the Levi, but he can invite his friends and family around, even non-Levites around, and they can eat it. And therefore, the Levi is entitled to, anyone is entitled to eat this fruit or vegetable, and therefore the maaseh, once tithed, can be eaten. However, before the maaseh can be eaten, the Levi himself had to take a 10th of his maaseh, in other words, a 10th of the 10th, which is 1% of the original product, and that is a second truma, which would be given to the Kohen, and can only be given to a Kohen, can only be eaten by a Kohen, and nowadays can't be eaten because Kohanim are impure or Tommy. So what we are left with so far is that the 10% which is tithed for the Levi can be eaten by anyone. The amount which is tithed for the Kohen has to be put in a plastic bag and disposed of because it can't be eaten. How much is tithed for the Kohen? The answer is a touch above 1%. The 10th of the 10th that's given to the Levi has to be tithed, and a tiny bit more, which is the truma itself, also has to be tithed, and therefore a touch more than 1% has to be cut off and disposed of. So this is the tithing so far. Now there is one more tithing which was taken, which is a second ma'aseh, a second 10%. I don't want to go into all the details other than to say that in some years of the Shemitah cycle, this would be given to poor people. In some years, this would be given to Leviim. The Shemitah cycle is a 7-year cycle. The 7th year is Shemitah, when a whole separate set of halachas apply. But the 6 regular years of the Shemitah cycle are divided into segments, such that in year 3 and 6, the 10% second tithe goes to a poor person. In years 1, 2, and years 4 and 5, the second tithing would be taken to Yerushalayim, where it would be eaten by anyone, every farmer in Yerushalayim. A very beautiful mitzvah. Every farmer would have to go in years 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the Shemitah cycle, take 10% of their produce up to Yerushalayim and eat it there with their family. It would keep the connection of farmers to Yerushalayim. This is known as Ma'aseh Sheni. So how do we navigate this Ma'aseh? So we take that 10%, we have to take that 10%, but we are unable to take it to Yerushalayim. We can't eat it there in purity, and we're not able to travel to Yerushalayim to do so. So we have to redeem it onto a coin. Where does the concept of redeeming it onto a coin come from? Well, already in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, if a farmer had grapes wouldn't travel well from his farm in northern Galilee, in the northern North Israel. He wouldn't be able to bring it to Yerushalayim, so he would transfer the sanctity onto a coin, take that coin to Yerushalayim, and there he would buy fruit. So we have a concept of transferring the sanctity of the fruit, of the second Ma'aseh, the Ma'aseh Sheni, onto a coin, such that the fruit is now secularized, and now the coin has the Kedusha, has the sanctity. Now, normally speaking, one shouldn't cheat the system. If I have £10 worth of grapes, £1 worth is Ma'aseh, which should be taken to Yerushalayim. If I can't take the £1 worth of grape to Yerushalayim myself, I should transfer it onto a £1 coin, take that coin to Jerusalem, and there I should buy fruit worth £1. However, again, since nowadays we anyway can't take this and eat it in Yerushalayim, I'm allowed to transfer the Kedusha onto a minimal sum of money. The minimal sum of money is a pruta, the smallest halachic measure of money, which is roughly, depending on the fluctuating price of silver, somewhere between 2 pence and perhaps 4 pence. For those who are interested in the maths of it, a pruta, if you do the calculation, is about 1/2000th of a troy ounce. And you can work out from that how you can work online how much the value of silver is, and work out at any stage how much a pruta is. It varies somewhere between, as I said, depending on the price of silver, somewhere between 1 pence and 4 pence. Starting at 4 pence, you're safe. So the Ma'aseh has to be tithed onto a coin. Okay, so all of this is very complicated. If you wish to do it properly and fully, you will need to remember everything I've said. You will need to take your fruit. You will need to separate off a small quantity and say this is truma, and put it to the side carefully. You will then need to separate a second quantity off, a tenth off this time, 1/10, and say this is ma'aseh. You will then separate from that 1/10, a tenth of the tenth, 1%, and say this is trumas ma'aseh. Package that together with your truma, bag all of that, and dispose of it, and then take a second tenth, Ma'aseh Sheni, and declare that you are redeeming this onto the pruta coin that you have in your pocket. So this is the optimal way to do the mitzvah if you understand fully the process of so doing. It's very clumsy, it's very difficult. It means one has to begin cutting off 10% and then another 1%, a tenth of that tenth, and it's awkward to do. That's complication number 1. Complication number 2 is around the coin that you want to transfer the Kedusha to. And this has 2 problems associated with it. Problem number 1 is, what do I do with the coin once the sanctity has been transferred to it? So let's say I'm transferring the sanctity to a pound coin, and I redeem my ma'aseh onto it. I'm allowed to redeem it onto a pruta worth of that coin. So my coin is £1. I check the price of silver, and I discover that the price of silver today is 4 pence. So I realize I can transfer 25 times onto this coin before the coin is full of maaseh. So I have to keep a record of how often I'm transferring onto this coin, so that the coin, once it's full, once the pound coin is full, I know that it's now full of maaseh. I have to check the fluctuating rate of silver in order to check whether the coin is full. Once the coin is full, what do I do with it? Well, the answer is I need to destroy the coin. I can't just throw it away because we're worried that someone will find it and use it unknowingly. So Chazal decreed it needs to be destroyed. By the way, in ancient Israel, how did they destroy it? They threw it into the Yam HaMelech. Very good way of destroying a coin. For those of us who don't live next to the sea and certainly don't live next to the salt sea, what do we do with a coin? Incidentally, under the Coins Act of 1971, I believe it's illegal to destroy a coin in the UK anyway. So how do we destroy the coin? If we would wish to do so and ignore the illegality for a moment, we would have to hammer it down or something of the sort. Very, very difficult. Bend the coin till it's unusable and therefore effectively have destroyed the coin. So this is one complication in practice transferring the Kedusha onto the coin. So we've identified so far 2 complications around this issue. Complication number 1 is understanding the whole tithing process and going through it step by step. Complication number 2 is transferring it onto the coin, keeping track of how full the coin is, and then destroying the coin. This is complication number 2. Complication number 3 is that there are technicalities around the coin that can be used to transfer the money onto. And here I just want to explain this issue very briefly. A coin, maaseh can only be transferred onto a coin if it is a minimal quantity of a pruta itself. If the maaseh is a minimal quantity of a pruta itself. Now, a pruta is 1 pence, which means that the produce has to be worth at least 10 pence, or sorry, a pruta is somewhere between 1 and 4 pence. Let's say the most highest price of silver, highest measure of pruta is 4 pence. That means the produce that I'm taking the maaseh, the tithe of a tenth from, has to be worth at least 40 pence, so that a tenth of this product is worth 4 pence and a pruta and can be transferred onto the coin. The coin has to have had a pruta worth of maaseh onto it before future transfers can happen, which are worth even less than a pruta, because a pruta is the minimal value of money. So if I have a fruit worth 40 pence, I can take off a tenth of it, transfer that to the coin. The coin now contains within it a pruta of maaseh, and then going forward, I can transfer even minimal quantities of maaseh onto it. But at least the first time I make the coin, I have to transfer at least a pruta's worth. Now, most fruit and veg is not worth 40 pence. An apple or a carrot is not worth 40 pence. If you are spending 40 pence on your apple, you're either buying it in Harrods or you're being conned. So fruit isn't simply worth that value. When you're mastering your fruit, it's unlikely that a tenth of it is worth a pruta. And this is a third problem in the coin that you're transferring to. At least once has to be used for a pruta's worth of maaseh. By the way, even if you wish to create such a coin by yourself and ensure that the first time I transfer Kedusha to it, it's worth a tenth, worth a maaseh, I have to know that what I'm transferring, tithing, is definitely obligated in Truma maaseh. But here in Chutz La'aretz, any carrot or apple or potato or avocado I buy from Israel may not be obligated in tithing at all. So where do I get the coin from to transfer onto it? As a result, there is a service offered by the Botei Din to make this whole process easier. And what the service does is 2 things. Number 1, it offers a coin which they maintain and change every so often, for which you can transfer the Maaseh Sheni sanctity onto. And number 2, they offer a brief text. And basically, the brief text says, we are aware that many people don't understand the complexity of how to take Truma and Maaseh. Therefore, everything should happen in line with the terms and conditions as specified by the Beis Din. And that's how I want the transfer to occur. So what I do is I take my fruit, and now we get to the final part of the shiur, the very simple way to do it. With all these complications, as we explained, it's a simple process. All I need to do is take my bag of peppers, take 1 pepper, cut off that 1 pepper, 1% plus a little bit, just over 1% of the quantity of pepper, and say I want the various tithes to take effect in accordance with the terms and conditions specified by the Beis Din, and that any redemptions that need to take effect should fall on the coin that the Beis Din has set aside for this, and with that, everything is done. So what started off as an enormously complicated process in which I needed to understand the full tithing process, and I needed a coin, and I needed to keep track of the use of the coin, and I needed to ensure this was a coin fit for redemption to take place, and dispose of the coin afterwards, has been dealt with us by the kindness of the London Beis Din, such that all we need to do is separate off 1% plus, make the declaration, I want everything to happen in line with the rules of the Beis Din onto their coin, and that is it. Bag that 1% plus, put it in the bin, and I've taken Truma and Maaser in line with halacha. And I just want to very briefly just share with you a screenshot of the webpage in the London Beis Din, where this is explained very, very shortly. This should be better known about. This is in the London Beis Din's website, and just have a look at this. On purchasing fruits and veg that come from Truma that come from Israel, how should I separate Truma and Maaser? Cut off and set aside just over 1% of the product, and say the following formula: all the separations and redemptions should occur in line with the policy of the Beis Din and happen and occur on their coin. Wrap up and throw away the separated piece, and that is what one needs to know in terms of practical halacha of how to do so. Now, I just want to add in a few other frequently asked questions around this, and with that we will finish for today. On the chat group, I was asked, if you buy, does this apply to Israeli produce at the kosher stores, such as Be Kosher, Tapuach, Kosher Kingdom, and so on? One needs to check with each store whether it has a hechsher or not. Some of the stores that you've listed do, some of the stores that you've listed do not. So stores which are not listed with a hechsher and it says that it comes from Israel, one should do the tithing itself. Similarly, if you get your fruit from Tesco, and it's listed as coming from Israel, you should follow, ideally speaking, the tithing itself. If, however, it doesn't tell you the country of origin, don't worry. In doubt, one does not need to tithe. As someone has already texted me off group, there's enough doubts here that mean that if you're in doubt whether it's been tithed, you do not need to tithe. This is fruit from Israel. It may have been tithed, unlikely, but it may have been tithed at source. There's a minority halachic opinion that it doesn't need tithing. You don't know which country this comes from. One doesn't need to worry about produce where the origins are unlabeled, but if you know the produce comes from Israel, you should do what I have said. Do we make a bracha on tithing? We've already explained here in Chutzlaritz we don't, because of the various doubts. If I've cooked produce and I haven't tithed it, one can tithe afterwards, and just when one makes one declaration, say, I want the tithing to occur on the produce that I have here, and any taste or flavor of the produce that's absorbed into the dish and into the pot and into the produce, the utensils and into the food that I have produced. So this can be done. One can't, by the way, tithe from one sort of produce onto another. So you can't tithe from your Israeli origins onto your Israeli potatoes. You can only tithe from one type of fruit to another fruit from one type within one type. If you have, by the way, yellow origins and yellow peppers and green peppers and red peppers, in principle these are one species and you can tithe from one to the other. But since these are different colors and therefore by definition belong to different batches, one should tithe each one separately because these are different batches. Finally, I've been asked that other Bati Din have different procedures. I mentioned the London Beis Din, the Federation has a procedure. There's various different Bati Din have a procedure. I'm not going to comment in this particular setting whether one is better than the other. All the Bati Din are reputable and can be used, their system can be used. A couple of people have posted to me about tithing on Shabbos and Yom Tov. And the answer is, generally speaking, one cannot tithe on Shabbos and Yom Tov. There are methods of tithing beforehand for Shabbos and Yom Tov. If you have forgotten to tithe on Shabbos and Yom Tov, you can rely on the lenient view that says that one does not need to tithe in Chutzlaret. So just to summarize, fruit from Eretz Yisrael, ideally speaking, should be tithed. Don't panic if you haven't tithed in the past. Don't worry if you're going somewhere where they don't tithe. But one should tithe and take Trumas and Maasros and connect to the mitzvah of Eretz Yisrael in that way. In actual practical halacha, how do I do this? Don't make a bracha, separate off 1% plus, bag it. Before you bagged it, make the declaration that everything should happen as per the ruling of the London Beis Din, then bag it and put it in the bin, and this is enough to do all the tithing in the simplest manner. Of course, our tefillah and our prayer is that we should be back in Eretz Yisrael, able to fulfill this mitzvah, not with loopholes and shortcuts as we've described, but able to fulfill it properly, to be able to give the trumas and mitzvahs to the kohanim, to the leviim, to take them to the shrine, to give them to poor people, and fulfill the mitzvah in the most mahudal manner possible. But for now, whilst we're living in Chutz Haaretz, whilst we are unable to perform the mitzvah properly, this is an appropriate way to do it in the minimal manner, and it's perfectly acceptable. So I'll stop there for now, and thank you as always so much for joining. Someone has just texted a troy ounce of silver currently is 18.48 per ounce, which should make, according to my calculation, a putta about 1 pence. So thank you for that. So I'll stop there for tonight, and I wish everyone a good evening. I'll stay on if anyone wants to ask questions.